Hi and welcome. We're into the first chapter in Psychology 1. You know, when I first entered post-secondary to study psychology, that was in the mid-70s, it's funny how members of my family and friends laughed at this, the whole notion of psychology, just in terms of what they thought about psychology. And still today, when I meet people and the topic of psychology comes up, it's pretty common to hear comments like, "Oh, great, so now you're going to analyze me now, right?" Or this one, "Why do I need to bother telling you anything? You're just going to read my mind." Well, it's just a reminder that things like these kinds of comments from family and friends, many of you know something about psychology, right? If I were to ask you the question, what is psychology? What would you tell me? Intuition, common sense, behavior analysis, mind reading. After this introduction, I'll show you a list of 10 true and false statements to test your common beliefs. You might be surprised what you actually know about psychology. First, a few points about psychologists. Psychologists cannot read minds, although they would like us to be convinced that they could otherwise. Not all psychologists can analyze you, or even want to, with accuracy. But they do know a lot about how and why we think and behave in the ways that we do. Psychologists use scientific, measurable methods to explain our behavior and thinking process, and it's to this point that we will focus on in this chapter. So, how much do you know about psychology? Check the questions, figure them out as best you can, and I'll give you at the end the solutions to this. So, definition of psychology: the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Now let's look at this a little more carefully. Scientific method is the process by which the scientific study is delivered or is explored. The scientific method is the orderly, systematic procedure that researchers follow. And this includes identify the research problem, design a study to investigate the problem, collect and analyze the data, draw conclusions, and communicate their findings to others. Now, in psychology, there are four goals of psychology. 1, description. What is happening? Make notes about what occurred, the behavior, the mental process, as accurately and as completely as possible. The observations are data, usually a good starting point for pursuing a new area of study. So what is happening? Describe it. 2, explanation. Why is it happening? An understanding of common conditions of the behavior or mental process, confirmed by ruling in or ruling out of alternatives, causes, and effects, under what circumstances. 3, prediction. When will it happen again? Identifying the conditions under which a behavior or mental process occurs. They can then begin to predict when or under what circumstances or conditions something is likely to occur again. And the 4th goal is influence. How can it be changed? Applying a principle to prevent unwanted occurrences or bringing about a desired outcome. How we can make life better, if you will. So when we think in terms of psychology, we can come also to some other terms. One being, what is a theory? Or we come up with theories. And so what is a theory? A theory is a general principle or set of principles proposed to explain how a number of separate facts are related to one another. A theory organizes facts systematically and guides scientific research. Now, there's 2 types of research that occur in psychology. There's basic and there's applied research. If you're conducting basic research, you conduct the research to seek new knowledge and explore and advance general scientific understanding. If you're going to conduct applied research, you're creating research that's specifically designed to try to solve practical problems and improve the quality of life of people. Now, there's a variety of different sorts of research. There's naturalistic observation. This is where researchers observe and record behavior in its natural setting with or without influencing or controlling it. Ideally, they want to not control or influence the behavior. Laboratory observations is behavior studied in a laboratory setting, allowing for more control and use of precise instruments. There's case studies. This is where they will do research or study a single person or a small number of individuals at great depth. Survey research, you've probably participated in a survey. Interviews or questionnaires are used to gather information about attitudes, beliefs, experiences, or behaviors of a group of people. Now, within the research, you need to select who you're going to research, so that's considered part of the population, an entire group of interest to researchers to which they wish to generalize their findings. A population, if you were going to study nurses or study North Americans or Canadians or Quebecois, that's your population of your studies. So you will need to come up with a sample from your population. A sample is part of that population that's studied in order to reach conclusions about the entire population. You can't survey all Quebecois, or you can't survey all of a population, so you select a sample. But you can't just select the sample you want. You need to get what's called a representative sample. And that's the sample that mirrors the population of interests. This includes subgroups and some in the same proportion as is found in the population. So if you're going to select a population of nurses, you're going to select the population that is equal to the number of men and women nurses. You're not going to sort of only research female unless that's the specific target for your research. But if you're going to research nurses, your population, then your representative population needs to be representative of the nursing population. Now, there is what's known as a correlational method, and correlational method is different than descriptive research. Correlational research looks to explain the phenomena by looking at other factors that occur along with that phenomena along the same timeline. So expresses a relationship between two variables. Now, it's really important, it does not show causation. It's not cause and effect. It really just means that these things occur at the same time. They're not trying to determine the degree of cause and effect. Why do students drop out of college? Is there only one reason? Of course, there's probably many different reasons. And so they would be correlational. What factors might influence this decision? Again, not a single one cause and effect. Correlational describes the strength of relationship between two or more variables. In other words, it explains how likely it is that you will find the two variables together. So, example, students' dropout rate and feeling of isolation are highly correlated. So when students feel isolated, they are at greater risk of dropping out. It's not cause and effect. It's just a relationship. We use a correlational coefficient to identify how strongly linked the two variables are. And it ranges from a -1 to 0 to +1. This means that variables can be positively or negatively correlated. 0 indicates the variables are unrelated. So let's look at the steps of an experimental method. The experimental method is the only research method to identify cause and effect between two or more variables or conditions. Now, to begin the experimental method, we must begin with a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a prediction about cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. So this is your educational guess about the relationship between A and B. Now, a variable can be any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. An independent variable in the experiment is the factor or condition deliberately manipulated to determine whether it causes change in another variable or condition. Researchers deliberately manipulate the independent variable. So that's the one you're going to affect change. So if I'm going to be changing how nurses do their job and the stress that they feel, one of the independent variables might be meditation. We're going to see if meditation affects how nurses do their job. I've only done half of that. That's the independent variable, meditation. Dependent variable, that's any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. It's measured at the end of the experiment. So, if meditation is the independent variable, what might be the dependent variable? If that might be, we could say, well, it's stress. So how are we going to measure stress? What measurements will we take? We'll take heart rate, blood pressure, things that are measurable, tangible, touchable, fact-based. Now, when creating an experiment, not only do we have to have a hypothesis and variables, we also have to have an experimental group, the group that is exposed to the independent variable. So I get 200 nurses, half of them are my experimental group and half of them are my control group. So the experimental group is the group that we expose the, in this case, meditation to. The control group, it's a similar group to the experimental group, made up of the same people, the same distribution, the same representative sample, and they're exposed to the same experimental environment. But they're not given the independent variable. They're just used to, go by their comparison. You guys, the nurses in the control group, go about doing your business the way you've always done it. The experimental group, you guys go and do meditation daily. So we have an experimental group and a control group. And then we collect our data. So one of the things, though, we have to ensure that we check on is sources of bias in research. So in sources of bias, there's a variety of them. One of them is called selection bias. Selection bias is about selecting participants and assigning participants to experimental or control groups at the beginning of the experiment that will predictably affect the outcome of the experiment. So in my nurses example, I will put all the best managed nurses, the ones who already have good health and good handling of stress, into the experimental model, so that when I show them how to do meditation, that it's going to have a desirable impact, because I expect that. That's a selection bias. I can't put certain nurses in here and certain nurses here. I have to randomly select them. Therefore, random assignment. This is where participants in experimental and control groups are selected by chance procedure. Everyone has an equal chance to be in either group. This is a control for selection bias. Now, a term you've likely heard before, placebo effect. This is when a participant's expectations influence the outcome rather than the independent variable. If I think that meditation is going to help me, whether or not it does, I can influence the outcome by feeling and believing that it will. So another way of protecting against some biases is what's called experimenter bias. And this is when the experimenters, let's say I'm the experimenter, have preconceived ideas that influence the outcome. By the way I interact with both groups might suggest this group should do better, and that's the experimenter bias. The way that we protect is what's known as the double-blind procedure, a control for these biases. Here, the participants in each group, the experimenters, like me, I might be an experimenter, we're not aware of who's going into which group. We don't know which group is which group. We just have it delivered. Now, one of the things that's really important in research is replication. The process of repeating a study with different participants, and preferably a different investigator, to verify the research findings. Good, solid research can be replicated. That means you will do a different population and have a different researcher and apply the same research to a different population and get a similar finding. So, what about, as you might have already been guessing, what about protecting research participants' rights? Can we do anything about the people who are involved in the research? Well, legally, cannot ask participants to do anything. It's illegal. So they have to be doing things that are legal, approved. One of the levels of approval is institutional approval, that the ethics and morality are acceptable. And informed consent, that People who participate voluntarily participate and can withdraw at any time. Deception. Now, there are some research that are very foundation of some psychology. We'll look at them later in the course, where deception was used, and only in the case of deception, only when the participants' awareness will be affected and will affect the outcome. So they have to be what's also debriefed, and debriefing, it's divulging the true purpose of and the rationale for an experiment to all participants at the end. And that's important in terms of the legalities and the protection of individuals and their rights. Okay, what we've done is gone through part 1 for this week 1. Part 2 of this chapter we'll pick up in week 2. All right, everybody, carry on the good fight. Bye now.